Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, dedicated to providing a safe space for victims and survivors to tell their rape or sexual assault experience as a step in their personal healing journey or in helping others on their journey. This platform is also devoted to explaining what it means to be trauma-informed and how important it is for each of us to know and understand the critical aspect of treating victims and survivors with a non-blaming attitude of belief, support, and empathy. This is episode 108, which is part one of a multi-episode compilation of the life stories and experiences of my guest, John Carey. John is here because he fully agrees with the mission and goals of this podcast, helping to bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault, as well as to normalize this type of conversation. Listen in as John does just that, and I'll catch you on the other side. Here's John. John Carey, thank you for joining me on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have you with me.
Let's hope.
That's a good comment to make right at the beginning. Let's hope. Hey,
we'll see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. Just for the sake of my audience, I want to tell you real quick that the reason I know John Carey is because he reached out to me via email, like I've invited all of you in my audience to do so if you want to talk about being on this show. John took advantage of that invitation and wrote to me and told me a little bit about his experiences and his story. And we have had a little get to know each other conversation about a week ago or so. And I really am honored and pleased that John has decided to go forward with being with us. John, I'm just going to ask you to open it up and tell us a bit about yourself.
Thank you. Well, I looked up on podcasts, a podcast about male survival or male recovery or male. I was looking up podcasts about sexual assaults and that kind of thing. And it's been in my life. So once in a while, I look for things that might be interesting to listen to and listen to what other people have gone through, what may have helped them, because there's always maintaining your mental health, no matter what you've been through. If you've been in the military or you lived in a war zone or you've lived in a residential war zone like I did, or you have certain things that you're dealing with, health problems, there's always good things to do to help maintain your mental and physical health and see how other people are dealing with what you're dealing with. So I thought your podcast was helpful, and I listened to some of the podcasts, and I was impressed by the stories I was hearing and how dealt with their situations. And one of the things I've done to help me is I wrote a book, sort of wrote it to myself as a younger person, but maybe it doesn't come as that way because I don't really mention that in the book. It's called Dream Another Dream, Recover, and Reimagine Your Life. I think that's what a lot of people have to do, no matter if they've come from an intense background, like I said. If you are someone who's been through horrible abuse as a child, the worse it was, the more likely you are to experience certain things in your adult life. If you don't take charge, you're more likely to be addicted to substances. You're more likely to get into anonymous sex and live dangerously, stuff that's not very helpful in a whole variety of ways. With me, it's been reading books, watching documentaries, and now listening to podcasts, writing my book. I get interesting feedback from usually men who've read my book who tell me stories. I think male sexual assault is grotesquely underreported. It's just kind of inbred, maybe the culture, not to admit to having been taken advantage of or abused, and people took advantage of it. They abused you, and it's not your fault. There shouldn't be any guilt for what people did to you and what they blamed on you. I was blamed for all sorts of stuff, starting from when I was a young boy. By 6, 7 years old, I was always being blamed for things. And there was one major blame that involved what happened to my mother when I was 4.5. I wasn't guilty of that, but it was taken out on me for the rest of my childhood and into my adult life. My intention with doing this is to help people. There's really no other reason for me to do it. I don't want to do it as a form of entertainment. I think it should be done to cover serious issues that impact the lives of millions of people.
Yeah.
Many have been victims of childhood abuse, unfortunately. That continues to go on. if you're in a household where it's clear that you're being neglected or abused, or, there's certain traits that children who are in horrible situations show just through their actions and their words and their behavior. And maybe that exposes them to predators who prey on children who can recognize that kind of thing. Grooming is real. There's things that I'll talk about that happen to me of what adults outside of the household did me. And it was clear that they knew that I was in a really horrible situation and they knew they could do things to me. People seek you out no matter what. Like there's always people they look for what they can get out of people, even in adult life. People like sucking up to famous people. Like there's always somebody trying to get something. They're trying to harvest what they can from the people around them. Maybe this will help people recognize things that they have been left with. That's one of the reasons I'm doing this, and help them manage themselves better. Hearing what I've been through, maybe it'll help maybe it'll reach someone and help one person. There comes a point where you have to do something to help yourself. You can't always blame and poor me, and you should discover your strength and your talents and skills and develop them and be like the parent you never had, the coach you never had, and get out of the train wreck and move on. Addictions to substances you can manage, like alcohol and drugs and things, and do things to get away from those, hopefully, and break those habits through whatever it takes, therapy and nutrition and exercise, filling your life with different things to help that with memories that you're left with from childhood. Like I've had nightmares my whole adult life. I've had night terrors where I've woke up and my bedroom was torn apart. That started happening when I was 18. I would lock my bedroom door when I was 18, and I know it was me who did this. I don't remember it. If you're having problems, that's not a weakness to go to therapy. There's groups, there's support groups, there's classes, there's documentaries, there's books you can study, but do it with the goal of moving forward. I'm doing this because I'm hoping that it'll help people and help them recognize and manage their situation. I know it's helped me to hear other people's stories, and I want to encourage people to aim for the better. It's up to you at a certain point where you need to move forward and you need to discover your own strength and talents and skills. And that's what my book, Dream Another Dream, is about, is recover and reimagine your life. I wish I would have had this book when I was 16 or 18, anywhere in my young adult life. But you need to move out of the train wreck of your own life. As far as addictions, I was comparing memories and addictions. There's substance abuse you can deal with through nutrition and therapy and exercise and getting out of the habits and breaking through that problem. But with memories, there's also a thing that you need to manage because you might be left with PTSD. It's good to recognize when you might be triggered and what your triggers are. Anything from sounds and music, colors, lighting situations, textures, things like that. Get involved in the solutions for your life through therapy. Is not a weakness to go to therapy. It's a strength. Find groups that can help you, classes that can help you, read books that can help you with the goal of moving forward rather than staying in the train wreck that you went through. Recognize that dumping all your thoughts on your friends and other close people is not helpful. You need professional help with psychologists. I found help with Jungian trained psychologists, but you might test out different psychologists to see which one is good for you. But also I encourage you to take other levels of things to help yourself, including exercise and living healthfully and nutrition and group therapy and reading books like Dream Another Dream.
Yeah. John, let me ask you a quick question. I've heard before that people don't feel comfortable switching from one therapist to another. And you just said something that I strongly believe in, and that is shopping for a therapist until you find one that you think fits for you. Do you see any shame or problem in saying, hey, this just isn't working for me, I'm going to try someone else for a bit?
I had to. The first one I went to, she fell asleep on the third session.
Wow.
And I just never went back. They're trying to help yourself and heal and move forward and build a better life for yourself and deal with your problems. You're not there to do what's best for the psychologist.
Yeah.
And he turned into this person who just seemed to be like being entertained by my stories. And I didn't really feel I was being helped. I just felt like I was entertaining him. And there was one point where he said that he loves this. This is like a textbook case. I'm like, oh, what do you mean by that? So I stopped going to him to eventually I went to that other therapist who was a Jungian trained psychologist.
Mhm.
There's a Carl Jung Center in Los Angeles. You could call there and see who's been trained through that center. There's therapists who've trained there who live all over the country and even in other countries.
Yeah.
So maybe calling the Carl Jung Center on Pico Boulevard in West Los Angeles and asking them who might be in your area trained with them and see if that psychologist is good for you.
Right.
But seek out other things. And that's why I encourage you to read books about the type of abuse you've been through or whatever, preferably written by psychologists with the goal of helping yourself. There are documentaries, but know that not everyone's story applies to your life. You got to do what applies to your life. My life might apply to your life, but maybe it's just going to be something that might be interesting. Before I go into my story, if you're still in an abusive situation, take precautions to protect yourself to transition away from that situation. You might be a teenager and you're stuck in a home that's abusive. You could go to your high school counselor and see what they might recommend. Rather than research things on your home computer or on your cell phone, go to the library and research things on the library computer. That way, your abusers can't see what you're researching. Go alone and find books there that might be helpful for you. Do things that can help you get out of your bad situation. About 8 years ago, I was home alone and I heard someone knock on my door. And then what happened next just sent my mind reeling into all sorts of thoughts about what happened to me when I was a child. I opened the door and there was a boy asking if I wanted to subscribe to the newspaper. And it just reminded me of being a 13-year-old boy. He looked like he was maybe 14. After I closed the door, my mind just like surged with this snake pit maze of unpleasant memories from my childhood. And that's when I also went to therapy after that. And I realized at that point, I just started thinking a lot about what happened to me as a child. My story is it started in the House of Woe in Ohio. And I realized I could look up on Google Maps and see the street view of the neighborhood where I grew up, including a nearby apartment building. That was where something happened to me when I was 13 that pivoted my life in a whole different direction in all sorts of bad ways. But when that boy knocked on my door, I had been reading through my journals because I was on the TV series Ray Donovan. I was in one episode. I had a silent part, but I played a character who was in a support group for adult men who survived childhood assault by priests. But in Ray Donovan, I think I was in the third episode, and John Voight was there with the actor who plays his son. And John Voight was like, "What are you doing here?" And started making jokes about abuse. After the scene was shot, John Voight thanked me for being so good in the scene. And he said he was playing off of me rather than anyone other actors. And he spoke to me for a while. We hung out. Even though I didn't have any dialogue, I guess whatever I did was believable. And then I've had people stop me and they recognize me from that episode and are like, "You were really good in that series," or "What are you talking about?" Because I've been in a bunch of TV shows and movies and stuff. They pick that show out and you like your reactions. But in that scene, I didn't say this, but I wasn't acting. I was remembering.
Yeah.
And I guess John Voight thought I was doing really good at my acting. And I was just sitting there remembering what happened to me when I was little. It set me into writing more about my childhood and being more active and speaking out and in finishing my book, Dream Another Dream, eventually that came out a year ago. I think it came out. To understand what happened in my family and to me, there are certain things that need to be understood. Key is there were personality altering head injuries suffered by my parents when I was 4 years old. They both suffered head injuries, and I'll talk more about it. I say like, you can't hate someone because they're injured. You're not going to hate someone because they injured their leg or they have a facial deformity or something that they have no control over. It's just that's the way they are. And so I really can't hate even though I had a lot of hate for them, and I still hate what they did, which is my experience and my feelings. they both suffered horrible injuries when I was 4.5. Right after I was four, my father, and then 4.5 when my mother suffered hers. I noticed even when I was that young that they were completely different people after that. So, how my family started is that my dad's grandfather was a severe drunk and got in a fight with his son, my grandfather, around 1923 in Ireland. And then my grandfather moved to America. He arrived at Ellis Island. He ended up in Pennsylvania. He married an Irish girl from Ireland who was born in Ireland. And then they had my father. And that girl, my grandmother, died days after my father was born, because back then it was the 1920s and things weren't so clean back then with labor and hospitals. And my grandmother got an infection from the childbirth and she died. And then my grandfather married another Irish girl. My father didn't know that that wasn't his mom who raised him. He always thought that was his mom, but they moved to Cleveland and she raised my father like he was her son, which he was, not through birth. My grandfather was a severe drunk and he kind of left the household and I guess lived on the streets. He mostly, by the time my father was a later teenager, my grandfather wasn't really there. But when my father was 13, my grandfather told him, enough school. And my father never went back to school after he was like 14 and he never graduated from high school. He sold hot dogs at the Cleveland Stadium. He polished shoes. It was during World War II. He did other things to make money and he was a boxer. He hung out with these other Irish boys and they had a boxing club and my father was kind of a tough man. He joined the army to go in the Korean War, but that's when he saw his birth certificate and that's when he found out that his mother was his stepmother because he saw a different name as his mother on his birth certificate. He got a foot infection when he was at boot camp and they kept him there and he didn't go to Korea and the rest of his group went to Korea and a lot of those boys died. But he stayed at the army base and he trained soldiers. He was, I guess, a drill. I don't know if he was a sergeant, but he put him through all the drills. But he did end up going to Europe to help pack up and move military equipment. By that time, he met my mother. She grew up in Cleveland. Her father was born in the U.S. to Scottish parents, and her father he was a smoker and a drinker. And my father was an only child, and my mother was an only child. At least that's what I thought until I was in my 30s, and I found out differently. But her mother was born in Scotland and moved to the U.S. with all her brothers and her sister. And then my mother's father had an affair with his sister-in-law, who had two babies from two other men. So my mother grew up with her father and her aunt. So that was a screwed up situation. Yeah. And my mother's mother also worked for a rich couple, rich, one of the wealthiest families in America at that time in Ohio, and ended up having a baby with the rich man. And that rich family adopted the baby boy who was born when my mother was young. So my mother had a brother and a sister, but I didn't know that until I was in my 30s. My mother and father married when they were in their later 20s. And then my father was an insurance salesperson. He was also getting into residential real estate after I was born. And then my mother made money because she sang at weddings and funerals. So she had mink coats. She had a couple mink coats because she had always go to these weddings and funerals. And as a toddler, I would go to the wedding rehearsals. I'd sit there in the pews at the Catholic church and listen and hear people compliment my mother on her singing. When I was a toddler also, she recorded 2 demo albums. These producers they wanted to take her to New York and get her a record contract, but that didn't happen because what I'm going to tell you about. So I was the 6th boy. I had 5 older brothers. I'm 63. My older brothers I don't know them anymore. One of them died, and then the others, I never really established a relationship with any of them. Then I had a sister 2 years younger than me who had Down syndrome, and then another sister born 4 years after me. And that seemed to be their goal, was to have a girl, because they really didn't want me or my brother, who was a year older than me, and they even would say so, because they got really mean after the head injuries, and they said all sorts of things all the time. But before the head injury, when I was in my early 4 years, my father was happy. He would always talk to the neighbors. He was like this friendly guy. I guess he made people laugh a lot. And he would play with us. And he would carry me around on shoulders and kiss us on our cheeks before he left to work. He wore suits and ties to go to work. And we lived in a better part of Cleveland on the far west side, which is an accomplishment for him because he grew up super poor in a cold water flat where there was no heat. There was no hot water. You'd have to heat the water to take a bath. My father's stepmother was our babysitter when I was really young, and we saw her every Sunday, and she would give me a mint every Sunday. That was a common thing. Every Sunday after church, we'd go see her at her little apartment in Cleveland, and she'd give me a mint. And she would come by and she'd clean the house and she'd babysit us, and she was strict, and she would polish the furniture. And I remember one of my brothers making fun of how clean my brother was a brat, and he started putting fingerprints on the furniture, and my grandmother got really pissed off. And then my father yelled at my brother. And I remember that from when I was like 3 years old, just my father getting really pissed off for my brother disrespecting his mother. When I was 4, shortly after my sister was born, my father was driving drunk alone, and he crashed into a telephone pole, and he went through the windshield, and he ended up cracking his skull open, and part of his brain was on the hood of the car, is what one of the emergency workers said. So he had a very bad head injury, and he came home from the hospital weeks later. And I was told by my mother's friend, don't go near your father. Don't allow him to pick you up. He can no longer pick you up. Because I used to run up to him and he would pick me up. And so I went near him. He was in the dining room, and he looked at me. He had this big Q-tip bandage all over his head. He just looked at me like he didn't know who I was or what I was. It was like he was gone. After that, his intellect sank, and he was no longer fun or happy or friendly. My mother had just had her 8th baby. Back then, probably never got the help she needed. And it was just the era. Who knows what happened to her when she was 16, but apparently I've heard that she wasn't really that stable, and I didn't know until later in life. I talked to some people who knew her, and they said, yeah, we all knew that she wasn't mentally stable. A few months after my father's head injury, there was a house fire in the middle of the night. I was 4.5 years old, and I remember it as if it happened 3 nights ago still, because it was so intense. There's 4 stories, so there's lies somewhere. One of the stories is that my mother put the trash in the incinerator. Back then, there were incinerators in the basement. You put your trash in there, and it's connected to the chimney that's in the living room, goes all the way down to the basement, and the incinerator would hook into that, and the smoke would go out your roof. Before she went to bed, she put the trash in the incinerator, but apparently she didn't close the lid correctly. And by the time she got upstairs, she smelled smoke, and she went into my sister's bedroom, which was on the first floor, and fire was already coming through their air vent. And one of my sister's beds was on fire. She grabbed the 2 babies and ran next door because the phone was already out. And so she ran next door to bang on the door. She woke up my father, and my father got my brothers out. But it's another story that my brother, Brian, who is a year older than me, threw a paint can in the incinerator. And I know that's not correct. And then another story is that the kitchen started on fire. And I know that's not correct, because a few weeks after the fire, I went to the house with my father, and I was in the kitchen, and the kitchen was only smoke damage except for one wall near the dining room had a burn hole in it. But the rest of the house had been gutted, and the piano fell into I looked down, and there was the piano burned up in the basement. It fell through the floor, and there was a bridge. The workers were starting to rebuild the floors, and they were going to eventually take the piano out of the basement, but they needed to build a support system to pull that up. The 4th story about how the house started on fire is my mother started it. And she told me that once when she was old. And to me, that kind of makes a whole lot of sense, because she already had maybe mental health problems and 8 levels of postpartum, and very depressed about what happened to my father. She was no longer married to who she was married to. She was married to this guy. And who knows, maybe the true story is that she put the trash in the incinerator, and she didn't close the lid right, and that started a house on fire. Because my brother didn't throw a paint can in the incinerator, and the kitchen didn't start on fire. So it's either the trash started the basement on fire, or my mother started it on purpose because she wanted to kill us all, which sometimes people do. So I woke up to the sound of one of my brothers trying to wake up my brother Brian. We slept in the same bed. We were little toddlers, and he slept at the other end of the Brian was holding onto the bed post and he was having a nightmare that he was in quicksand. And my brother's trying to wake him up. And there's all this smoke and there's all this noise. There's fire coming out of the air vent. And I'm all confused. I could hear my father yelling and sirens outside. And my two brothers, Brian and the other brother, ran. But then fire came out of the air vent in the hallway and ran back, and I tried to join them. We tried to run through again and fire came out again, but then the fire stopped and they ran, and then I didn't get through, but the floor was getting hot and I was barefoot. So I ran through fire to go to the stairs, and I'm running down the stairs and the stairs are hot, and a fireman grabbed me, takes me outside and puts me in a crowd of people, gathering neighbors. So everybody else in my family was at the neighbor's house, and my mother was, "Where's Daniel?" That's my first name. My father called me John. People thought that I was still in the house. So my mother ran and my father ran up into the house while it was burning. And firemen had arrived and are spraying the house and breaking windows so they could get water into the house. And they gave up. And then my mother fell down the stairs and landed on her head on concrete and also damaged her lung. And she could never sing again, which I didn't know until I was in my 30s about why she never sang after that. But that maybe plays into why she hated me so much. She blamed me for a lot of things. She would say stuff like, "If you were never born," and I didn't really know what the background to that was, but I started hearing stuff like that when I was little. And I grew up hearing stuff like that from her. She was really regretful to me. And also when I was born, she would remind me that her mother died when I was born and that she was stuck in the hospital with me and couldn't go to her mother's funeral. And I'm like 6 and she's saying stuff like this to me really hatefully. And I didn't know what that was about. We lived in a rental house, but first, like the 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks, my mother was in the hospital with her head injury. We were on a farm, a dairy farm, and it was great. They had 3 sons, and Brian and I ran around these 3 sons who were basically our age and hung out on the farm and went to the river, and it was kind of dreamy and cool, but except for our house had burned down and we didn't know where our parents were. And then after a few weeks, my mother and father showed up, and my mother looked really grim. She had black eyes because I guess when you damage the front of your brain, blood leaked. It was explained to me once by a doctor, but that may have been why she had really dark eyes. But she also looked really like a different person, just very depressed and everything. We moved into this other house, and not a good area of Cleveland. It wasn't the best. My brother started being a little bit rambunctious. My parents were really troubled. My father's mother was having a lot of health problems, so she wasn't really able to, she wasn't there really anymore. And she died like just a few months after we moved into that house. And my parents were having so many problems. They didn't have brothers or sisters. They didn't have parents. All my grandparents had died. We were thrown into this situation where we just didn't have the money. My father ended up working as a milkman. People back then, you would have bottles of milk delivered to your house, you know, and he did that. And he also worked for a laundry service that picked up and delivered to hospitals and convention centers and restaurants and stuff like that. And so he no longer was an insurance salesperson. And we struggled because he didn't make much money. But there was this teenage boy who was 18 who lived a couple houses away, and his name was Renato. He was in an Italian family. He didn't like my brothers, but he took to me and he was teaching me how to play soccer. Then he was gone. He joined the army, and it was the Vietnam era. And he wanted to be as like his father because his father fought in World War II in Italy. And now he wanted to do his service, and he joined the army. Renato was gone, and he was my older brother or something. He was just this really cool teenage boy. He got shot in Vietnam just a couple months after he joined the army, and he died 2 days later in the hospital in Vietnam. And then there was a wake held at his house, and his parents sat out on the porch, and people lined the whole street. Was lined with people coming to pay respects, a lot of Italians, people from church, teenage girls who knew him. And I was looking out the side window watching this, and my mother walks in. She was dressed in black, and she, "Get away from the window. They don't need you looking at them." She just could snap really angrily sometimes. That put a shadow over the whole neighborhood. At that time, there were thousands of boys being killed every month, and parents were nervous, and people don't understand that era. It was really dark and disturbing and sad and tragic. And every day there were more and more news stories of soldiers being killed. There was a famous Life magazine that came out that was 1 month of deaths in Vietnam. And it was just a month of all the photos of all the soldiers killed in 1 month. We were getting poorer and poorer. We were going to Catholic school. I didn't go to kindergarten, and I don't know why. I went to first grade. So I was kept home during what would have been my kindergarten year. And that first Thanksgiving, when I was 5, we were in that house, and my parents had this big Thanksgiving and invited those people where I stayed on the farm. And some other people came to the house and who had helped us out. And we had this big Thanksgiving dinner, and there was a horrible snowstorm. My brothers were getting drunk. I was 5. There were a couple of them, they weren't even 10 years old, and they were getting drunk. That was the start of it with them. They tried to get me drunk. I had already been drunk once when I was 5, and I hated the feeling and the taste, and it was just gross. But they were trying to get me to get drunk. I'm 5, and I'm, no, I don't like it. It turned out where eventually I had learned, because I would see other kids there too. The pubs up on the street, they would put their bottles out at night. So there was free alcohol every day behind the bars for any kid who wanted to get drunk. But I didn't really take to my brothers. By the time I was like 5, it was already apparent that they were just getting really rambunctious, and our parents weren't being very attentive. The only thing that kept us really in order was going to Catholic school and putting up with the nuns, having to wear a tie every day to school. I wasn't in school yet, but they had to they had to have their hair cut short, and they had to wear a dress shirt every day, and we went to church every Sunday. We weren't altar boys because my father barely went to church, and I guess priests didn't like that, or I don't know what happened. But one time when I was that young, I was 6, and I went walking with my brothers in winter, and we wandered over to this train track area, and there was this abandoned building next to the train station. This is in the deep freeze, cold Cleveland winter. And we found a dead body of this frozen man in this building. That's just something that happened. But I didn't really hang out with my brothers. That was just one of the very, very few times I ever spent time with them. My first friend that I got was in 3rd grade. There was a boy, and for the first time I felt I had a friend. And at lunch, we would run around and laugh, and this girl would join us, and we just played tag together, and we ran between all the other students, and we were always laughing. And we would all go home for lunch because everybody lived a 10-minute walk from the school. People would walk home for lunch and then eat lunch and come back to school. But this one day, I was walking back to school after lunch, and there were all these noises, sirens. Some people were running up the street. I got there, something on the next street, so I walked around the back of the school through the parking lot and got to the bushes, and I couldn't get any further. It was all this commotion, and my friend and his brother were killed. A drunk driver ran over them when they were walking home from lunch. We got to class, and I didn't know until in class, somebody came to our classroom and explained that this boy, who I was friends with, and nobody seemed to know that he was my friend, was killed. Later that day, the whole neighborhood was just quiet. I went walking after I ate dinner by myself, and I walked up and around the corner and saw the house where the car ran over my friend. And there were 2 other boys there also looking, kind of just staring at this lawn, and the lawn had blood on it. This one boy found a coin, a dime, and it had blood on the coin. And I just didn't even think he should pick it up. And then the man in the house came out and just asked us if we could please leave because his wife was very upset. But there's a key thing that was going on when I was little is when I was a baby, my father brought home this puppy. They named it Debbie. And Debbie took to me and was sleeping in my bed, was always at my feet when I was eating. And whenever I came home from school, would greet me, and I would sit next to her when she was eating. And we'd go for walks, and she'd hang out with me in the backyard. I started planting a garden in the backyard when I was 7. I was just always interested in the outside. And I was the kid who raked the lawns and cut the lawns and raked the leaves and shoveled snow starting when I was young. I just always did that. And I was made fun of even for doing that. My brothers like to tell my mother that I did stuff that I didn't do to see what my mother would do, because my mother was out of her mind. I mean, there's no other way to put it. She was just not together. They would say that I swore, and I'm like, I didn't swear. And she'd come up and slap me again for lying. She would drag me by my ear to the sink and wash my mouth out with soap. And my brothers thought it was funny. But my dog tried to protect me. My brothers also started They got into doing stuff to me when I was young. They thought it was funny that I was easy to make cry. I didn't know until I was 24 that I had kidney disease, but I was really easy to make cry. I have to like hit my sides, and they thought it was funny. They'd show their friends how easy it was to make me cry. So I was a crybaby, and my mother would tell me, stop crying. And I was always in pain. But my dog would snip when somebody tried to attack me, like my brothers or my mom, even. My dog was smart and knew that I wasn't being treated right. But my mother didn't like my dog. And so I heard her planning with one of my brothers. I'll tell your father that she's biting people. I heard her and I said, Debbie never bit anyone. But she told my father that my dog was biting people. This is a key because I'm telling this, there's a reason. So one day I come home and my dog's gone, and I'm 8 years old, and where's Debbie? And my mother said, I sent her to the pound. And I just like, we need to go get her. I was all panicking, and we need to go get her. And she's like, well, she's gone. Debbie had puppies, and she kept this one dog and named her Pansy. Pansy never took to me. Pansy actually would attack me when my brothers were attacking me. So it was this whole different situation. But my father got home, and I threw a tantrum, and I made my father take me to the pound. It was unbelievable because I just never really said much. And here I am throwing a tantrum, demanding my father take me to the pound. We go to the pound, and they had killed her. So there went my dog. I was very sad and confused and angry and frustrated. And I think one of the things that made my mother also, when I go into the next part of the story, get even darker is she got pregnant when I was in second grade. And she seemed very excited about this baby, and she wanted another girl, but she went into the hospital and she had a miscarriage. There's either the baby was born dead or born and lived a couple hours or 2 days. There's different stories that were told. I never knew what was true. My mother would often change stories a lot. I would hear her say stuff to people. But after that, she just seemed even more dreary, and she would often stare. When my father was around, she would behave differently than when he wasn't around. Like when he was around, she was like in the kitchen making food, being like a housewife. But when he wasn't around, she was just like miserable. She slept a lot. She stared a lot. She would say stuff, mutter like, why can't I just die? I'm like, 8, and I'm hearing my mother say this, even like pound on her legs. Why can't I die? Why can't I die? And it was just not a good situation. When the baby died, I didn't know what to do. I remember just a couple months before that, there was this boy whose sister died, and he was in school and he just started crying. And I was in school this one day, and the day after my mother came home, and I was all upset, and I went up to the teacher. I was a substitute teacher, and I couldn't speak, and I just started crying. And she's like, go back to your seat. I went back to my seat and stopped crying and never talked about it to anybody. But by that time, I was well aware, even at that age, that I really had no one to turn to. My brothers were getting drunk already. My father was disconnected. He didn't really talk to us. He didn't spend time with us. He was always gone. Everything was grim. We were poor. The house was not good. Things weren't cared for. My parents were neglectful. We were just kind of on our own. You would cut your leg and you would have to take care of it yourself and stuff like that, but that's the way it was. I was like 7, 8 years old. And if I got injured, there was never any pain pills or anything. If I twisted my leg, and I'd have to like suffer through the pain and the swelling and wait till it goes away. I didn't know about putting ice on things. So there was like this neglect going on. And there was this situation where I had a large wart on my wrist and a large wart on my knee, and they would always get bumped and they would bleed, and nothing was ever done. But this one teenage girl noticed. There was this girl a couple houses away. She was very pretty. She lived in the camper in the driveway because she wasn't allowed in the house because her stepfather found her too attractive. And I'm hearing this when I'm like 7 and 8 years old. And what? So she was only allowed in the house when her mother was home. People knew. She would even tell people that she couldn't go in the house unless her mother was there because her father found her too attractive. But she saw my knee and my wart and my wrist wart, and she told me to start coming by once a day to her trailer. And I would go there every day, and I would knock on her door, and she would bring me in, and she would clean up my bloody wart, and she would put the wart ointment on. And every day I went to her, and then eventually the warts fell off. So that says something about my situation where other people noticed that I needed things. And even the 16-year-old girl was taking care of me. And things just got darker. The house got dirtier. My brothers got rowdier. Like I said, I think the only thing that was keeping them in some kind of a structure was going to Catholic school. It was clear we were in poverty. I remember food stamps and anything that we needed to buy was just very stressful. My mother, I would say by that time, when I was 8, she was really getting delusional and she was always angry. And my parents would yell a lot at night. She would feed us dinner and tell us to go upstairs and don't come down. And then my father would come home drunk. They would get into these loud yelling matches. And my father never took to my brother, who was a year older than me. There was this argument. My father was yelling at my mother because this man would come by to see the boy. It only makes sense now when I think about it. I really don't think my brother, who was a year older than me, was my full brother. I think the man who was coming by was my brother's father. And my father knew about it. And I think it really bothered him. And there was like this whole situation going on between my parents because of what my mother did. But what are they going to do? They're poor and they have 8 other children. And they basically didn't seem even interested in each other anymore. And my mother hated life. And she would say it when my father wasn't around. And she would tell my sister, even when she was like 5 years old, my sister was 4 years younger than me, don't get married, men will ruin your life. And I would hear my mother on the phone talk about to her friend that she hated my father and she hated the way he smelled and she couldn't stand sleeping near him. And he would come home drunk and she couldn't stand the smell of him. And these are the things I'm hearing when I'm 7, 8, 9, 10. She would yell at my father. She didn't want all these kids. She's going to take Rose or my sister and leave. One thing I should say is that people might think I'm being disrespectful of my family about telling this, but my sister, who is 4 years younger than me, actually encouraged me to tell my story. And eventually, like in the last few years, and my mother, who died 10 years ago, I did have some contact with her before she died. And she told me that I should tell my story. And I told her, like, if I told my story, it would make you look really, really bad. I haven't even gotten into what the things she did, but she said she didn't care because she would be dead. And oh, wow. Okay. So I don't feel any shame. I'm not doing it. I don't even know my brothers. I haven't seen them in decades and really won't even say anything about what I know about them now because we have no contact. But I know stuff about them and it's not good. And my mother was like, we could send Ellen to my other sister who had Down syndrome, and Ellen died when she was 28, but we'd send Ellen to the facility and I'll take Rose and you could have the boys. That's what she would say to my father during these yelling matches. There was a situation where my brother Brian, who was a year older than me, wet his bed for the first 10 years of his life. And my father would come upstairs and beat the hell out of him. It was bad because he would scream and yell and holler. And one time I heard my mother telling my father downstairs when they're yelling that he wet the bed again. And she was talking about my brother Brian. And we heard my father coming up the stairs and we knew he was going to come up and beat Brian up again. So I told Brian, get in my bed, I'll get in yours, because I was just going to take it for him that night. I got in bed and I turned the other way and I put the blankets on me and he just like came in the room and just started pounding on me and whipping me with his belt. And it was really painful. I'm 8 years old and it was so painful. I couldn't believe it. And I was trying not to make any noise, but I let that noise out of my voice. And he realized it. What is going on? What's he doing? Like, he realized he's beating me instead of Brian. And then he just starts beating Brian. He goes to the other bed. It was bunk beds. I was on the top bed and Brian was in my bed below. And there were times where my mother would send me to the bar, the pub, when I'm like 6, 7 years old to find my father. And I would go up to the top of the street and there were like 3 or 4 pubs. I go to pub to try to find my father and then find him and walk up to him and say, Mom says, come home. And then I would walk away and then I'd see him wandering behind me drunk on the way home. But then he started taking me with him to the pub and giving me a soda, and I'd sit there and he'd get drunk at the bar. That only happened a few times, but there was a thing. This is where it starts. This is the sexual assault. So if you have problems with sexual assault stuff, maybe tune out or wait for a better time where you could hear this kind of thing.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Don't forget to tune in next week for part 2 of John's detailed stories and experiences describing not only his abuses and sexual assaults, but also his healing and personal growth. To all of you who've joined us for this episode, thank you for being here. I hope that you will take just a quick second to give this show a rating and to subscribe to SAS. Every new subscriber and positive rating helps promote this show to others and in turn helps bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Thank you for your support. It would also be extremely appreciated if you would go to the new Sexual Assault Survivor Stories page on Instagram and click that follow button. Being a follower also helps further the mission and goals of SAS and provides the opportunity for more people to have access to the site and to this show. Thank you in advance for following. I look forward to being with you again next Tuesday as I bring you part 2 of John's amazing story and growth. In the meantime, don't forget to start by believing whenever you encounter a victim or survivor who's reaching out for support and telling their rape or sexual assault experience. Because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.